Now, Finance Minister Mpho Sithole is set to table a special budget later today. The new budget is expected to reflect billions in lost tax revenue due to the lockdown and large sums of extra money not budgeted for in February to support the relief from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the minister has called for a zero-rated budget. The South African accountancy body SAICA has warned that one of the biggest challenges the finance minister will face is revenue collection. A month ago, the South African Revenue Service projected a revenue collection shortfall of 250 billion rand as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated lockdown. To expand on this, I'm joined on the line now by Director of Tax Advocacy at SAICA, Dr. Sharon Smulders. Dr. Smulders, a very good morning to you and thank you for your time. As the Finance Minister tries to fend off a debt crisis, which he said on social media, in his own words, it could see the debt to GDP levels exceed 100% over the medium-term budget, pardon me. As you look at the statement and you assess the situation on the impact of COVID-19 and really just judging from the numbers that were estimated in February to where we are today, what are the biggest challenges you foresee?
Well, first of all, the biggest challenge is collecting revenue. But I think even bigger than that is on the expenditure side. So if we have to take a budget for any household, for instance, if you don't have revenue coming in, you can't incur expense, or you shouldn't be incurring any additional expenditure. Because if you incur more than you're actually earning, you have debt. And if you have to take out debt, you have interest repayments. And that puts South Africa in a very precarious position if we don't have enough money to sort out our social injustices because we're busy paying interest on the debt that we have to incur. So not getting revenue in, and we need to remember that 90% of our South Africa's, the country's budget income comes from tax. So if we don't collect tax revenue, we cannot incur the expenditure that we need to incur to ensure that we not only survive this COVID-19 but carry on in the foreseeable future.
And in a situation like this, how does SARS and Treasury then bridge or even try to close this gap?
Well, it's a tough one. SARS is trying to do its best over and above the understaffing issues that they had before. They've now got COVID-19 added onto that. So they're having to deal with a lot of these individual cases because a lot of the relief measures were done on a case-by-case basis. You had to actually apply to get approval to get the access to the relief. So it's put the revenue authorities under a lot of pressure, and we're finding that they are struggling to keep up. Lots of branches have been closed because they have had cases of COVID-19 amongst their staff members. So they are struggling, but they're trying to do their best, I think, in the situation at the moment. Treasury's concerns are even bigger, I think, because they've got to look at the expenditure side, and I think that's where our problem lies at this stage. And as Mr. Mboweni said, if we've got to start living within our means. We no longer can spend the way that we used to spend because our expenditure has to be limited to our income because our alternative is that we need to borrow this money. So let's take a household budget. Say your income is 1,500 Rand. If your expenditure amounts to, say, 1,900 Rand, now bearing in mind this is all in billions for the country, you have a loss of 400 Rand. To cover these expenditure that you've over incurred, you now have to go borrow that money from, in our case as an individual, a bank. That bank will charge you interest. At the moment, every rand of income that is coming into the government's revenue coffers, 15 cents of that is going to interest. That means 15 cents cannot be used to build schools, to ensure our healthcare is working correctly. And that 15 cents is going to increase more and more now, the more we have to borrow. And that's where the zero budgeting comes in that the minister alluded to, is to say that we can't carry on spending like we do. We need to cut our expenditure to ensure that we can not only cover the normal expenses that we had, but to fund this additional COVID expenditure that the country is having to incur.
As we try and take into account the current economic climate, the financially distressed consumer, and the very bleak picture that you paint as you speak, what does this mean in terms of expectations, in terms of revenue collection for the rest of the year?
Well, the concern that we have is, as you mentioned, the estimated revenue collection is down by about 285 billion. So let's take my example. You had 1,500 of income, 1,900 expenditure. You had a loss of about 400 Rand. Add on the additional loss now because of the reduced expenditure of, say, let's make it 300 Rand. you are sitting at a loss of 700 Rand. So the debt that you have to now get is more and more and more. So we have to be so strict with the expenses that we are incurring now as a country. And that's where he says the zero budgeting, you actually have to look at every single line item of expenditure and say, is it necessary? Is it going to add value to the majority of the people in our country? And is there an alternative, a cheaper alternative to what we're actually currently spending on, if you can justify the expenditure? And this is critical, because if we don't bring down our expenditure, we're just going to incur more and more interest. And eventually we're going to have to lend from the IMF that will put all these strict measures in place for us. We won't have a choice.
Let's expand a little bit on this zero budget approach in terms of assessing it and how it would fit into South Africa. Would it really work for us?
It's difficult to say at this stage. The negatives with zero rate budgeting is it does take a long time. You actually start from scratch every single year. You don't take like in normal budgeting. You take your previous budgeting and generally you add on to that certain needs that you might have for the foreseeable future. With zero rate budgeting, you actually start from scratch. You have to reevaluate every single expenditure spend. So it's time consuming, and at the moment our government officials do not have that time, or some say it's debatable because they're not rendering the services, but it's a change in the way that government has been doing things since forever, and you need certain expertise to do it. So you would have to be able to justify the value of a project, etc., and how do you do that? So at the moment, I don't think it can happen straight away, definitely not. But it is something that we're going to have to, even if it's piecemeal, start introducing into our budgeting process.